Chapter 14 of Charles Sumner, the Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimké. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reconstruction and Colored Suffrage. At the close of the war, the gravest of problems remained to be solved. The riddle of the slave sphinx still awaited its Oedipus. How should local self-government be reconstituted in the old slave states was the momentous question then to be settled. Sumner had his plan, others theirs. His he erected on the simple basis of equality. No mere party considerations entered into its straightforward intention. He was not careful to enfold within his scheme any principle or device looking to the political supremacy of his section as a section. It was freedom which he was ever and solely solicitous of establishing, the supremacy of democratic ideas and institutions of securing and assuring forever to the newborn nation. He desired and strove for the ascendancy of his section and party so far only as they were the actual custodians of national justice and progress, the real possessors of the great and quickening principles of human rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence. Long before the end of the rebellion, Sumner's mind had begun to grapple with this problem. As early as February 11, 1862, he broached the subject in the Senate in a series of resolutions touching the constitutional status of the rebellious states and the duty of Congress in regard to their government and reconstruction. State rebellion is state suicide was the pivotal proposition of the resolution. With the termination of statehood, slavery terminated also, since it derived its existence solely and exclusively from the authority of the state. By reason of their insurrection against the supremacy of the Constitution, the Southern states had reverted to a territorial condition, and like all national territory, their government devolved upon the United States. It was therefore the duty of Congress to assume complete jurisdiction of such vacated territory where such unconstitutional and illegal things have been attempted, and proceed to establish therein republican forms of government under the Constitution, and in the execution of this trust provide carefully for the protection of all the inhabitants thereof, for the security of families, the organization of labor, the encouragement of industry, and the welfare of society, and in every way discharge the duties of a just, merciful, and paternal government. Such was the radical and comprehensive scheme for Southern Reconstruction presented thus early by Sumner. Its introduction produced quite a flurry of feeling in the Senate and the country at large. Republican leaders like Fessenden, Sherman, Doolittle, and others promptly disowned it as the policy of the party. They were not mistaken in so doing, for the Republican party at that time had not so much as dreamed in the brain of any other man than Sumner's of a plan at once so bold and radical for the reconstruction of the rebellious states. 4 years later, however, these very leaders and the great body of the Republican party had caught up with Sumner on this question and occupied then substantially the position taken by him in those famous propositions. These propositions he elaborated and defended in an article published in the Atlantic Monthly for October 1863 and entitled Our Domestic Relations, which the paper contended hinged upon one question, viz., how to treat the rebel states. State suicide and the reversion to territorial conditions of states in insurrection against the supremacy of the Constitution, which was the keynote and the keystone of the article, ran without doubt entirely counter to the constitutional fiction, at once a state, always a state, which lay at the bottom of the policy of the administration in the conduct of the war. So totally distinct was Sumner's idea from that which had officially obtained in the prosecution of the war, that Montgomery Blair, a member of Mr. Lincoln's cabinet, felt it incumbent upon him to take issue with the article and to point out that its author had directly arrayed himself against the President on a question of fundamental policy in the conduct of the war. The tremendous struggle in which the nation was engaged for its life attracted the entire attention, absorbed the utmost energies which could be put forth of government and people. There was neither time nor disposition under these circumstances to consider less imperious questions. Catch your fish and do your frying afterwards. Conquer the rebellious states, then determine how they shall be treated, was the unconscious policy pursued by the government until near the close of the war. Even Sumner, forehanded as he always was where freedom was concerned, was silent on the subject of Reconstruction after the publication of his Atlantic Monthly article until the spring of 1864, when the Senate, having under consideration the credentials of certain claimants as senators from Arkansas, he introduced a resolution declaratory of the necessity of the vote of both houses of Congress for the readmission of rebel states into the Union. And a little later, on June 13th, in fact, when the Senate was discussing a joint resolution for the recognition of the Free State government of Arkansas, he spoke with almost unwonted earnestness, urging the importance of making haste slowly in that direction, as well as the duty of securing from the rebel states what he described as irreversible guarantees as a condition precedent to their readmission into the Union, which they had attempted to destroy. The question raised by the joint resolution seemed to him the gravest presented for decision, since it was determined to meet the rebellion by arms, and he opposed the admission of Arkansas at that time and under then existing circumstances as improper, unreasonable, and dangerous. The readmission of a rebel state, he declared, is not less important than its original admission into the Union. It is not enough, he argued, if we comply with certain forms as constitute a state in name only. Much more must be done, and all this must be placed under fixed and irreversible guarantees. Vain is victory on the field if these guarantees are not obtained. But the Senate was not yet ready to grapple with the problem mooted by Mr. Sumner. The resolution for the admission of Arkansas and that of Sumner defining one of the conditions of Reconstruction on reference to the Judiciary Committee were reported upon adversely by that committee, which had the effect for the nonce to push out of the Senate the whole subject of Southern Reconstruction. With the sweeping successes which were attending the Union armies in the field and the probable certainty of the speedy collapse of the rebellion, the subject of rebel reconstruction began to attract the notice of others in Congress than Mr. Sumner. As early as February 15, 1864, Henry Winter Davis of Maryland reported a bill in the House to guarantee to certain states whose governments have been usurped or overthrown a republican form of government. This bill, among others, provided for the assembling of constitutional conventions chosen by loyal white male citizens. In the Senate, the principle of colored suffrage as an element in the reconstruction of the rebel states was proposed for the first time by an amendment to the Davis bill, extending the basis on which the constitutional conventions were to be chosen so as to include the freedmen. But the Senate, by vote of 5-24, rejected the novel and revolutionary proposition. Clearly, the idea of colored suffrage had not then found a foothold, certainly not more than a foothold in the Republican party. The House bill was finally passed by the Senate, but even without the new radicalism of suffrage for the Southern Negroes, it failed to meet the approval of the President, and so came to naught another attempt to formulate a scheme for the reconstruction of the South. The principle of colored suffrage the Senate had twice before voted down, first in the case of the Territory of Montana, when a bill organizing for its temporary territorial government was under consideration, and second in the case of the city of Washington, when a bill to amend its charter was on its passage through that body. In both instances it was attempted without avail to extend the elective franchise to colored men, inhabitants of the territory and the city respectively. Sumner strove strenuously on each occasion against the non-exclusion of colored citizens from the register. About the beginning of 1865, the subject of Reconstruction had made considerable progress upon the attention of statesmen. The case of Louisiana served still further to advance the question in that regard. On February 18th, Mr. Trumbull reported in the Senate a joint resolution recognizing the government of that state, inaugurated by a convention held at New Orleans, April 6, 1864, as the legitimate state government. There was no provision in the new order thus instituted which extended the right to vote to the negroes. The state therefore was to remain in the hands of the very people who voted 4 years before to take it out of the Union. The danger to freedom, to the Northern idea which the war was establishing at an expenditure of so much blood and treasure, seemed to Sumner extreme in view of the possibilities of a return of the South to power opened by the Louisiana Bill. The readmission of Louisiana was a pet enterprise of President Lincoln. He had set his heart on inaugurating his experimental policy for the reconstruction of the rebellious states with the restoration of this one to its old place in the Union. The joint resolution was accordingly pressed upon the attention of the Senate, and a vote insisted upon, but no vote could its friends obtain, owing largely to the firm and vigilant opposition of Sumner, and to his parliamentary skill in the contest, which continued several days before a postponement of the subject was secured. Another attempt to reconstruct the South thus came to naught. If the Republican party was not then at all disposed to adopt Sumner's plan, it was not altogether willing to swallow the precedents for the constitutional rehabilitation of the slave states. The struggle over the Louisiana Bill developed the fact that at that date the Republican party was not in favor of adopting colored suffrage as a condition of reconstruction, nor was it included in the President's scheme. On the contrary, it was an open secret that Mr. Lincoln took the failure of the joint resolution to pass the Senate quite to heart. He was sorely disappointed and chagrined, so much so, indeed, that it was thought Mr. Sumner's responsibility for the failure would cause a breach between him and the President. But Mr. Lincoln was a politician of too much calculation and tact to allow the occurrence, however unpleasant, to interrupt the intimate personal and political relations which existed between himself and so powerful a leader. Accordingly, on the evening of March 5th, he promptly stopped the wagging tongue of Madame Rumor by inviting Sumner to accompany him to the inaugural ball, where the two statesmen appeared before the public on the old friendly footing. Had the wise and tactful Lincoln remained at the helm during his second term, it is impossible to say how far he might have been able to control the reconstruction policy of his party. That he would have exerted a distinct influence in shaping its character seemed not at all improbable, but his death put a man in his place as lacking in his great qualities of mind and heart as it was possible for destiny to pick up wherewith to present a presidential contrast. It is hard to understand why Lincoln was taken and Johnson left, but as there are no accidents in the universe, Andrew Johnson therefore could not have been an accident. We must believe that his accession to the presidency at the time and under the circumstances was one of those historic occurrences through which an increasing purpose runs. About a week after the death of his great predecessor, Chief Justice Chase and Mr. Sumner called in company on the new head of the nation to learn something of his intentions with regard to the reconstruction of the rebel states and to urge him to espouse the cause of equal rights for the colored race. Mr. Sumner fancied that the President seemed impressed. A few days later, Sumner, who was full of uneasiness and apprehension as to the President's course toward the South, called again on Mr. Johnson and had a second conversation with him on matters discussed during the first visit. It is possible that Sumner and the Chief Justice did all the talking at that time, and that Sumner, who was alone at the second call, talked the whole time, then also to the willing exclusion of the President. Be that as it may, Sumner went away believing that he had received from the strange man positive assurances of agreement on the colored suffrage question. To Mr. Sumner's appeal to him to use the power and influence of his great office toward carrying into the new political order then soon to be established in the South the principles of the Declaration of Independence, Mr. Johnson replied, "On this question, Mr. Sumner, there is no difference between us. You and I are alike." Sumner went away deceived in the purpose of the President. It is possible that Mr. Johnson was no less deceived in his own purpose. His visitor and himself forgot, perhaps in the glow of Sumner's earnestness and eloquence, that after all, he, Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, was a Southern man with the traditions, the prejudices, the mental and moral limitations of his section, from the slavery of which no Emancipation Proclamation was able to liberate his mind, free him for one moment as a voluntary and thinking being and ex-slave holder. It was natural enough that such a man should approach the Southern problem from the standpoint of his section rather than from that of the North, and that he should attempt to reorganize civil society in the old slave states in the interest of the old masters rather than of the freedmen. Such an attempt, however, at the time was utterly impracticable, could not possibly succeed. No reconstruction of the seceded states had the slightest chance of adoption as the national policy in that regard, which proceeded upon the absurd assumption that the victorious North had nothing to do with the business. But unfortunately, such was the character of President Johnson's Reconstruction policy. On the other hand, the old slave masters, in the sun of this extraordinary policy, undertook to frame constitutions and establish governments upon a corresponding assumption that their former slaves had no rights which Southern white men were bound to respect. When the work of framing the new constitutions and laws was finished, it was plain to the dullest comprehension that the freedmen were as completely serfs under the new order as they had been slaves under the old one. Nothing was changed except a name. The old wrong lived on, vital in every part. If African serfdom was now to take the place of African slavery, was the serf power to ascend the throne of the slave power also? What then had the war settled? What had the expenditure of the blood and treasure of the North effected if instead of Southern slaves the nation was to be cursed with Southern serfs, if in room of the rule of slave masters there was to succeed the reign of serf masters? Like fire, these passionate questions ran through the North. The conflagration which ensued consumed to the ashes this first attempt to reconstruct the rebel states, but we are anticipating. Congress had adjourned, and Sumner had gone home under the glad impression that the anti-slavery work of his life was ended, when the President began his Reconstruction performance, which, as it progressed from one reactionary step to another, excited through the North astonishment and consternation, accompanied by a rapidly increasing storm of protest and indignation. Northern alarm and Northern demand found voice in a speech made by Sumner before the Republican State Convention of Massachusetts, held at Worcester, September 14, 1865. Sumner, in view of the grave emergency which the President's Southern policy had precipitated upon the country, was chosen to preside at this convention. To him, all the friends of freedom turned in the new crisis for instruction and inspiration, and from such a platform his words were sure to go to the ends of the North. Without expressly taking issue with the President, for Sumner and others still clung to the delusion that Andrew Johnson might be made to see the error of his way, and be induced to take a fresh departure in unison with Northern sentiment and purpose on the Reconstruction problem, and were therefore somewhat mindful not to launch into hasty opposition to the official head of their party. The Worcester addresses, nevertheless, sounded the keynote of the Republican Reconstruction policy with no uncertainty of meaning. Justice and protection was its watchword. Justice to the freedmen, protection for the North. They were intimately linked, the one with the other. Security for the future should be the cornerstone and keystone of the reconstructed Union. Defeated in war, the South designed now to retrieve its broken fortunes by a resort to fraud and cunning in the restored Union. The abolition of slavery it was scheming to nullify by substituting for it the old wrong under a new name. The freedmen were to be chained to the soil, reduced to serfdom, while the rebel states were to return to their old places in the Union, in consequence stronger in federal numbers than when they seceded to set up a slave empire. This enlarged representation, conspiring with the Copperhead party of the North, would presently reestablish Southern domination in the Republic. This well achieved, the new serf masters would proceed with the execution of their monstrous program, which included a repudiation of the national debt, or else an intention to fasten upon its payment, as a condition, the payment of the rebel debt, also compensation for the emancipated slaves, and the pensioning of rebel soldiers equally with loyal ones. Safeguards, irreversible guarantees, security for the future against these perils must be demanded and insisted upon by the Republican party, speaking and acting for the victorious North. Irreversible guarantees could not be obtained by haste, by executive action, by yielding to the prejudice of color, by oaths or pardons. How then may they be obtained? 1. time is necessary. 2 rebels must be excluded from political power. 3 a hand of iron in a velvet glove is required in dealing with the leaders of the rebellion. 4 the North must turn to constant loyalists in the South, regardless of race or color. 5 it must look to Congress, which has plenary powers over the whole subject. And finally, all of the guarantees thus obtained must be completed and crowned by an amendment of the Constitution expressly providing that hereafter there shall be no denial of the elective franchise or any exclusion of any kind on account of race or color, but all persons shall be equal before the law. Thus spoke Sumner to Massachusetts, who in turn took up the stern, deep note and sent it pealing through the North and in the ears of the President. But all heedless of the rising storm, Andrew Johnson bent himself stubbornly upon his obnoxious course. In November, Sumner remonstrated by telegraph with him. They were words thrown away. Republican remonstrance and protest exerted not the slightest effect upon the conduct of the President, who metaphorically had taken the political bit between his official teeth, and regardless of the frantic outcries of the North, was dashing willfully and viciously with the results of the war toward an overturn where all would be lost. The Republican party was almost stupefied with fright. Thaddeus Stevens, who had not yet adopted colored suffrage as a condition of Reconstruction, was almost in despair lest the North should, since the President had proceeded so far, acquiesce in his policy as a finality before the meeting of Congress in December. Stevens had but one hope, which was to get the rebel states in a territorial condition. This was in the line of Sumner's Reconstruction policy. That once accomplished, the Pennsylvania congressmen did not doubt Congress would then be able to deal with the question and avert the impending peril to Northern political ascendancy, which was generally looked upon as one of, if not the capital achievement of the war. Henry Winter Davis saw but 2 modes of averting the threatened catastrophe of a return to power of the South and the restored Union, and they were for Congress, on assembling, to pass a law by 2/3 over the President's veto, prescribing the conditions of reconstruction of any State government, and declaring none Republican in form, which excludes Negroes from voting, or secondly, to pass an amendment of the Constitution over the head of the President prescribing universal suffrage. Mr. Davis did not, however, anticipate with any confidence that the then coming Congress would be equal to these things. He was in despair at the national outlook, and died suddenly when Congress had been in session but a few weeks. Sumner shared in the general dejection and foreboding of disaster. His apprehensions as a statesman and a man were indeed intense. So great were these fears of evil that he determined to make a final attempt to induce the President to hearken to the prayers and remonstrances of his party, and to abandon his mischievous policy in the treatment of the rebel states. On the eve of the assembling of Congress, he called on Mr. Johnson in pursuance of this purpose, and though the interview lasted 3 hours, Mr. Sumner at its close was convinced that the President was beyond the reach of reason, and that there was nothing for the Republican party to do under the circumstances but to annul by congressional action the presidential policy, and to save the results of the war to the North and the Negro by a reconstruction which should guarantee protection to the one and citizenship to the other. The prevision of Winter Davis that the Congress which was to convene in December 1865 would not be equal to the contest with the President was fully borne out by its performance, or rather by its failures in that regard. This was owing partly to the indisposition of many Republican members of both branches to take issue with the administration, lest the doing so should perchance divide and damage the party, but more especially was it due to their strong unwillingness to adopt the idea of colored suffrage as a condition of reconstruction of the rebel states. In one form or another, the equal rights of the colored race was almost constantly before the Congress. It was actually equal, however, to the passage over the veto of the President of the first Civil Rights Bill, which opened all courts, state and national, to colored persons as parties and witnesses as to white citizens, but it could not conquer its prejudice against an extension of the suffrage to the Southern colored man, until assisted by the fall elections of 1866. To cross that Rubicon of Reconstruction, a radical leader like Sumner could not budge it an inch during its long session. The Republican majority of both houses shrank back from colored suffrage as the government had previously shuffled and played the coward before emancipation and colored troops. How to protect the North and the Republican party against the return to power of the South without resorting to colored suffrage was in truth the problem which the Congress endeavored to solve. could the ascendancy of the Republican party be preserved and Northern supremacy in the Reconstruction Union be secured without having recourse to so extraordinary and extreme a measure? If so, that Congress wanted to discover just such a go-between way and to walk therein. This was true then of leaders like Fessenden, Sherman, and Trumbull, who afterwards accepted the new radicalism, aye, of stout-hearted Thad Stevens and sturdy Ben Wade as well. They all in that Congress desired and sought without ceasing another and more convenient way to attain their object, viz., the political ascendancy of their section in the Republic, the erection of a permanent barrier against future tidal waves of Southern domination over it. This grand end Congress attempted to reach by a proposition to apportion representatives among the several states according to population, with a proviso which excluded from the basis of representation all persons excluded from the right to vote on account of race and color. The calculation of the author of the device, who was Mr. Blaine, and of the Republican members of Congress who supported it, was that the South, caught between the upper and nether millstones of it, would rather than have its federal numbers reduced extend the right to vote to the freedmen, in which case the new voters would augment the numerical strength of the Republican party and so confirm it in power. But if, on the other hand, the South should, in view of these future consequences, refuse to take that horn of the dilemma presented to it by Congress, it would be thrown upon the other horn, which would operate with no less fatality to any future revival of its political ascendancy under the Constitution. Thoroughly clipped in the wings and spurs of it, the dreaded Southern bird would, of course, be no match in the national cockpit for the mighty Northern fowl. Plainly, the prime object of this scheme was not protection for the freedmen. Protection for the North and the Republican party was the one clear end which it was designed to reach. If the negroes got there too, so be it, but their safe arrival could not be, under the circumstances, chargeable to the Republican party, but to an inscrutable Providence, for whose action in the premises that party could not possibly be held accountable at the polls. Against this compromise proposition Sumner set himself like flint. He was not willing to entrust national security to the chapter of probabilities and accidents to which they were committed by the Blaine Amendment. He would establish irreversible guarantees of freedom and the public faith and the national peace, all of which could be done in but one way, and that was by carrying out in the reconstruction of the South the promises of the Declaration of Independence, by the ample execution of the constitutional injunction to guarantee to the several Southern states, as a condition precedent to their readmission into the Union, a Republican form of government. Nor more nor less would he support or be satisfied with. Colored suffrage, he argued, was not a matter of national choice at all, but an overruling necessity. It was the all-sufficient guarantee, being in itself peacemaker, reconciler, schoolmaster, and protector. And now, he said finally, declaring my belief in liberty and equality as the God-given birthright of all men, let me say, in the same spirit, if this be an error, it is an error I love. If this be a fault, it is a fault I shall be slow to renounce. If this be an illusion, it is an illusion which I pray may wrap the world in its angelic forms. The Blaine Amendment, after a while, passed both houses of Congress, but was vetoed by the President. It was thereupon carried by the lower chamber over the veto, but in the Senate, owing to Sumner's opposition, it failed to receive the requisite two-thirds vote, and therefore was never submitted for ratification to the states. Sumner's opposition to this pretty political contrivance, which was to secure protection to the North and the Republican party at the expense of the Negro, called down upon him from his Republican associates a good deal of harsh criticism. Thaddeus Stevens, in particular, bitterly blamed him for its final failure to pass the Senate over the head of the President. But none of these things moved Sumner from his fixed purpose to make colored suffrage an indispensable element in the reconstruction of the South. The dread of a return of the South to power in the restored Union had another and unmistakable manifestation in this Congress. It was the meaning of the movement to secure the admission of Colorado and Nebraska to the ranks of the states, which would, when effected, give the North 4 more votes in the Senate and as many in the House before the rebel states got back into their old places. Protection was the soul of this attempt, protection for the North, not for the Negro, which the constitutions of these would-be states left no room for doubt. Each of these instruments limited the right to vote to white male citizens. But here again Sumner's uncompromising spirit proved a thorn in the sides of his party. His associates, not all, but many of them, were for creating 2 new states, regardless of the wrong which their fundamental laws did the colored race, because the exigencies of party called for more votes in Congress and the Electoral College. But with Sumner, principle was ever above party. He could not vote to grant the prayer of these applicant states when they came with the stain of inequality and caste upon their hands. No, however great might be the emergent needs of party, he could not and would not vote to admit Colorado and Nebraska until their constitutions were Republican in form and consistent with the Declaration of Independence. Even stanch old Ben Wade did not consider the matter worth fighting for in Colorado, in view of the insignificance of the number of colored people in the territory. But Sumner retorted with characteristic integrity of purpose that we should fight for a principle if by the sacrifice of it only one man was injured in his liberties. In other times, he exclaimed, the cry was, no more slave states. The cry of our times should be, no more states with inequality of rights. After a protracted struggle, Colorado and Nebraska were compelled to abandon the obnoxious distinction contained in their respective constitutions. It was not, however, until the short session that Nebraska got in, and this was achieved over the veto of the president. Colorado was less lucky, and her admission was longer delayed, but the principle of colored suffrage as an indispensable prerequisite for admission into the Union was established by the precedent made in the case of the former. Sumner turned his attention likewise to the abolition of the hateful distinction against color which disfigured the election laws of the District of Columbia. Having become a member of the Committee on the District of Columbia, he pressed the justice of colored suffrage upon his associates until the committee reported a bill prohibiting any exclusion from the right to vote on account of race and color. An educational qualification was at first grafted by way of amendment upon the bill, but it was afterwards rejected in the Senate, owing no doubt to the growing feeling that the suffrage must be without this qualification if the adoption of colored suffrage in the Reconstruction of the South were to act as a barrier against the return of that section to power in the Union. This was at the long session of the 39th Congress, which could not be relied upon for any radical handling of the colored suffrage question in opposition to the president. The bill extending the elective franchise to colored citizens of the district was, under the circumstances, allowed to go over to the short session when the autumn election of 1866 should have occurred, and given the popular cue to dubious-minded congressmen on the subject. The rapidly rising tide of public sentiment was flowing with accumulated force in but one direction, viz., toward a reorganization of the rebel states on the basis of universal suffrage as the only sure guarantee to the continued political ascendancy of the North in the Union. Sumner was therefore wise to postpone action on the district bill to the short session, when the voice of the Northern people should have been heard at the polls on Reconstruction and colored suffrage. On the first day of the short session, he pressed the district elective franchise bill to a vote in the Senate. 10 days afterward, that body passed the measure without the educational qualification provision. The next day, it went promptly through the House. It was vetoed by the president, but was passed by both houses over the veto, and so became a law as well as a guide for similar legislation in the Reconstruction of the South. The 39th Congress, having had its courage stiffened by the elections, was ready to inaugurate a policy of reconstruction of the rebel states in opposition to that of the president. The House took the initiative by the passage of a bill for the efficient government of the insurrectionary states, which, as it went to the Senate, contained no provision in regard to colored suffrage or to the exclusion of rebels. The consideration by the Senate of this bill developed wide divergencies of views on the subject by the Republicans of that body. Some were satisfied with measures of protection simply, while others wanted to add to protection colored suffrage as an act of justice to the freedmen, which would operate at once as a safeguard to themselves against that the old slave masters, and the best possible protection to the North from the same class. This latter view finally prevailed with the Senate, which adopted a substitute bill introducing the principle of colored suffrage into the South. This bill was rejected by the House because it did not exclude rebels from the right to vote. Without such a provision, it seemed to Thaddeus Stevens that the measure, instead of protecting, would open the floodgates of misery. The Senate, however, insisting on its substitute, the House receded from its position and passed the Senate bill with an amendment which embodied to a limited extent the principle of exclusion of rebels. This action of the House was concurred in by the Senate, vetoed by the President. The first Congressional Reconstruction Act passed both houses over the negative of the executive, and so became law. Congress, influenced by its fears, had at length got itself in motion, and nearly in line with Sumner's position on the Southern question, by requiring that in voting for delegates to conventions to frame constitutions for the rebel states there should be no exclusion on account of race or color, and that this principle of equal suffrage should be embodied in the instruments so framed as an indispensable qualification for the readmission of these states into the Union. In addition to colored suffrage as a factor in the reconstruction of the South, Sumner maintained that it was the duty of the national government to guarantee universal education for that section also, and a homestead for every head of a family of freedmen. He was besides in favor of a more rigid exclusion of the disloyal portion of the Southern population from participation in the government of the Southern states than was provided for by the Reconstruction Act. He wanted a provision incorporated in the Constitution of every Southern state requiring its legislature to establish and support a system of free public schools open to all without distinction of race or color. All these things were included in his scheme for the reconstruction of the South. All these things he tried again and again to have Congress include in its plan in that regard, but without avail. Two other Reconstruction measures, supplementary to the act passed March 2, 1867, went through the 40th Congress in quick succession. Each of these acts, like the first law, encountered the objections of President Johnson and was thereupon passed over his veto by the two houses of Congress. The contest between the national executive and the national legislature had meantime become very serious. The President seemed bent on balking Congress and defeating the will of the North respecting the reconstruction of the South. The veto power was in constant requisition by him. With this powerful weapon he ran a tilt against every measure passed by Congress and bearing any sort of relation to the two races in the South. Not even the joint resolution proposing the adoption of the 14th Amendment by the States was able to escape the presidential negative. On this amendment to the Constitution, the North may be said to have set its heart and hope. The attempt of the President to kill it excited against him in consequence throughout that section passionate indignation and fierce aversion. The people became furiously anti-Johnson. Congress, as the strife waxed between it and the President, became furiously anti-Johnson also. More than any member of either branch of Congress, with the possible exception of Thaddeus Stevens, was Sumner opposed to the President and his Southern policy. And the President so understood it and returned the hate of those great men measure for measure, heaping up and running over. From the steps of the White House, in a speech to a number of citizens who had gathered to pay their respects to him as the head of the nation on Washington's birthday of the year 1866, Mr. Johnson classed Sumner, Stevens, and Wendell Phillips, and with Jefferson Davis, Toombs, and Slidell. And Sumner's animadversions, it must be confessed, were hardly less personal or complimentary to the President, whose message on the Southern situation, the defender of humanity, characterized on the floor of the Senate as whitewashing, finding a parallel between the whitewashing message of Franklin Pierce, which covered up the crimes committed against free Kansas by the slave power, and the whitewashing message of Andrew Johnson, which covered up the actual condition of things in the South. A year later, the Massachusetts senator in the same place did not hesitate to denounce the chief magistrate as a bad man who had exposed himself in a condition of intoxication while taking the oath of office as vice president. His speeches were rated as maudlin, and their author was accused of degrading the country as it had never been before degraded. Nor were there wanting allusions to rumors of pardons sold or of personal corruption, nor yet the ominous invective that the President was the enemy of his country. The denunciation of the President as the enemy of his country naturally enough produced a sensation among the friends of the administration in the Senate. The Speaker was quickly called to order, first by Mr. McDougall, and afterwards on its repetition by Mr. Doolittle. On the first point the chair, Mr. Anthony of Rhode Island, declared the remarks in order, and on the second point, the question being submitted to the Senate, the language was again sustained. All this was significant, the grave charge against the executive head of the nation, and the action of the presiding officer of the Senate and of that body itself in relation to it, highly significant of the impeachment scheme which Congress was even then preparing for the overthrow of its hated adversary. Sumner's frank, fierce criticism of Andrew Johnson was strongly condemned by several of his Republican associates, like Fessenden and Sherman, on the ground that, as a senator, he would be called to sit as one of the judges before whom the President would be tried in the event of his impeachment. But Sumner held firmly to the complete immunity of the Senate in that regard, and its duty to consider the facts and circumstances of the case in advance of impeachment. For himself, he did not doubt that the President was a bad man, and that he should be watched or removed. This was certainly the view which Congress took of the matter. So decidedly was Congress of the opinion that the President needed to be watched that it hardly dared to adjourn when once it assembled. If it passed an act to check his activity in one direction, he was sure to break out in another. It was move and checkmate, checkmate and move between them according to a sort of perpetual motion. When Congress convened, Sumner begrudged the least fraction of his time for adjournment, which could be added to the term of the session. On one occasion, Mr. Grimes of Iowa moved the adjournment of the two houses at 11:30 on a given date, whereupon Sumner suggested 12 o'clock instead, giving as his reason that he was not willing to leave one half an hour to the President within which he may take advantage of the absence of Congress and issue commissions which might run to the last of the next session. The President had announced his intention to kick out of the government the opponents of his policy, and as he was a man with rather light extremities in this respect, he soon set to work with a vengeance to prove himself as good as his word. The opponents of his policy began to feel, in consequence, an official vis-a tergo as far and as fast as the presidential heels could reach. By the Tenure of Office Act, Congress essayed to restrain to a limited extent this recalcitrant propensity of the President. To Sumner's mind, the check imposed by the act went not far enough. He proposed to include within its intendment all officers and agents except clerks, and the vacation of all offices filled by the President or heads of departments without the advice and consent of the Senate since July 1, 1866, on the last day of the month of February of the year 1867. Sumner's amendment being altogether too drastic a dose of congressional rule for Republican stomachs to take, for there had already developed in the party decided differences and symptoms of reaction in the contest with the executive department of the government. It was rejected by the Senate, but no sooner had the Office Tenure Act become law than the President, through the interpretation fastened upon it by his legal advisers, was able to evade its provisions. And so went on this duel between Congress and the President, growing fiercer and yet more fierce week after week and month after month, until, exasperated to the highest degree of passion and resentment, Congress shot its last error, the impeachment, in the hope of destroying the one-man power of Andrew Johnson. Sumner sat as one of the judges of the impeached President and voted him guilty of the high crimes and misdemeanors charged upon his head by the House of Representatives. Sumner filed a powerful statement of his reasons for so voting. Swiftly, in the track of the congressional reconstruction measures, armed foes sprang up to shoot them to death. Violence and misgovernment arose all over the South. Tremendous scenes and saturnalias of blood and scoundrelism appeared in every state. Thieves and thugs established between them a reign of terror, the like of which history has rarely been called to shudder and weep over. Sectional and party selfishness and short-sightedness was the fatal rock on which the congressional attempt to reconstruct the Southern states was wrecked. The President's policy had left out the Negro and the North. The congressional plan had ignored the South and included the Negro as secondary consideration only. The terrible illiteracy of the new citizens and their appalling poverty this scheme did not grapple with or seek to reduce. Alas, Congress did not perceive that the Southern serf power, so justly dreaded by it, could not be overthrown but by the general diffusion of intelligence and property among those who constitute the basis of that power. No plan or policy looking to the ultimate solution of the Southern problem will prosper which does not seek primarily the education and social well-being of the laboring classes of that section. And this, we think, is what Sumner had in his mind when he proposed a public school system for the South, open to all without distinction of race and color, and a homestead for the head of every family of freed men. End of chapter 14.